Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind the noise of busy cities, crowded streets, and the endless rush of modern life. Instead, we're traveling nearly 2,000 years into the past, to the quiet coastline of the Roman Empire, where lonely stone towers stood patiently beside the sea. These towers were Roman lighthouses, and inside them lived ordinary men whose names have almost completely disappeared from history. They were not famous generals, they were not wealthy merchants, they were not powerful emperors. They simply kept a fire burning through long, peaceful nights, helping strangers find their way safely home. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Leave your country or city in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how many different corners of the world gather together for these quiet journeys into history. And if slow, peaceful history helps you relax or drift off to sleep, you might like to subscribe, so you won't miss future bedtime journeys through the ancient world. Now, perhaps dim the lights. Pull the blanket just a little closer. Find the most comfortable position you can. Take one slow, easy breath. There is nowhere to rush, nothing to solve, nothing expected from you. For the next couple of hours, all you have to do is listen. Almost 2,000 years ago, long before electric lights illuminated coastlines, the Mediterranean Sea stretched quietly beneath the same moon that still rises above it today. The waves arrived gently upon rocky shores, just as they always had. They whispered against weathered stone, then slowly returned to the open sea, again and again, generation after generation. Far from the magnificent city of Rome, beyond the marble temples and crowded marketplaces, stood isolated towers built for a remarkably simple purpose. They guided ships, nothing more, nothing less. From a distance, a Roman lighthouse appeared almost timeless. Built from pale limestone or carefully cut blocks of local stone, each tower rose patiently above the coastline. Its walls were thick, its foundations were deep. Every stone had been carried, shaped, and carefully placed by skilled hands many years before. The builders probably never imagined that their work would quietly watch over countless sunrises long after they themselves were gone. The sea breeze moved constantly around the tower. It carried the scent of salt, damp earth, and distant seaweed drying beneath the morning sun. Sometimes the wind was almost silent. Sometimes it sang softly through narrow windows carved into the stone walls. But it was almost always there. A quiet companion that never seemed to leave. Inside the lighthouse, life followed a rhythm that changed very little. Each morning began almost exactly like the morning before. The keeper would wake before sunrise. Not because anyone ordered him to, but because routine had slowly become part of who he was. The small room where he slept was simple. A wooden bed, a folded wool blanket, a clay oil lamp, a rough wooden chair, a small chest holding the few belongings he had gathered throughout his years beside the sea. There were no luxurious decorations, no polished marble floors, no colorful mosaics, only practical objects that served their purpose quietly and faithfully. Perhaps that simplicity made the room feel peaceful. There were very few distractions, very little noise, very little that demanded attention, only the steady breathing of the sea outside his window. As dawn slowly approached, pale blue light entered through the narrow opening in the wall. The keeper sat up slowly. There was never any reason to hurry. His first moments of the day belonged to silence. He stretched his tired shoulders, placed his feet carefully upon the cool stone floor, then listened. Sometimes he could already hear distant gulls calling above the harbor, sometimes only waves, sometimes nothing at all. Even silence has many different sounds. He lit the small clay lamp beside his bed. Its gentle flame flickered quietly, just enough light to begin another ordinary morning. Nothing dramatic would happen today. In fact, if everything went well, almost nothing memorable would happen at all. And strangely enough, that was exactly what everyone hoped for. The keeper folded his blanket with practiced hands, placing it neatly at the end of the bed. There was no written rule that required such care, but after many years, small habits became part of everyday life. Outside, the eastern sky slowly exchanged its deep shades of blue for softer colors. A gentle ribbon of pale gold rested along the horizon, promising another calm morning beside the Mediterranean. The lighthouse itself seemed to wake together with the sun. Its thick stone walls, still cool from the night, slowly gathered warmth as the first light touched their weathered surface. Some of these stones had been standing here for decades, others perhaps even longer. Every winter storm had left its mark. Every summer breeze had polished another tiny corner. Yet the tower remained exactly where it had always been, patiently watching over the coastline without asking for recognition. The keeper stepped outside onto the narrow platform near the top of the lighthouse. For a few quiet moments, he simply looked. Looking was one of the most important parts of his work. Not searching, not worrying, simply noticing. Far below, small fishing boats rested peacefully inside the harbor. Their ropes creaked gently against wooden posts. The tide lifted each boat only a little before lowering it again. It was a movement so slow that anyone watching for only a few seconds might hardly notice it at all. A cool breeze carried the familiar scent of salt water, mixed with damp wood and freshly repaired fishing nets. It was a smell the keeper had known for so many years that he rarely thought about it anymore. In the distance, beyond the quiet harbor, the open sea stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere far beyond that invisible line, merchant ships were already making their slow journeys between distant Roman provinces. Some carried grain from Egypt, others transported olive oil from Hispania. Some brought wine from southern Gaul, others carried marble, pottery, wool, glass, spices, or carefully written letters, destined for people who had waited many months to receive them. The keeper would never meet most of those travelers, yet every evening, his work quietly became part of their journey. He turned toward the great beacon. During daylight, the fire no longer burned. Only a thin layer of cool grey ash remained inside the large bronze fire basket. Before another night arrived, everything would need to be prepared again. Nothing about tending the beacon happened quickly. First came the cleaning. Using a simple wooden brush, the keeper slowly swept away the soft ash that had gathered during the night. The movement produced small clouds of fine grey dust that drifted lazily into the morning air before disappearing with the breeze. Any pieces of charcoal that could still be used were placed carefully into a separate basket. Nothing useful was wasted. Supplies did not arrive every day. Sometimes weeks passed before another delivery reached the lighthouse. Carefulness was not simply a good habit, it was necessary. After cleaning the fire basket, the keeper inspected the iron supports beneath it. Heat slowly weakened metal. Salt carried by the sea slowly encouraged rust. Small cracks sometimes appeared where yesterday everything had seemed perfectly strong. Finding these tiny problems before they became serious was one of the quiet responsibilities that no visitor would ever notice. And yet, the safety of countless sailors often depended upon such unnoticed work. The keeper smiled slightly, not because anything exciting had happened, but because everything appeared exactly as it should. Sometimes an ordinary morning was the greatest success anyone could hope for. He walked slowly around the circular platform once more. From here, almost every direction offered another peaceful view. To the north lay gentle hills covered with scattered olive trees. To the south stretched endless blue water. Behind the lighthouse rested a small settlement where perhaps only a few dozen families lived. Thin streams of smoke now rose from simple stone houses as morning meals were quietly prepared. Children would soon begin helping their parents. Fishermen would already be casting their nets. Bakers would be tending warm ovens. Potters would shape fresh clay. Farmers would walk slowly toward nearby fields. Every person carried their own ordinary responsibilities. None of them expected history to remember their names. And perhaps that is what makes their lives so fascinating today. History often celebrates emperors and battles, but most people never stood upon a battlefield. Most people simply woke each morning, did their work, shared meals with family, watched the seasons change, and quietly grew older beneath the same sky. The lighthouse keeper was no different. His life was not extraordinary. It was beautifully ordinary, and that quiet, ordinary life would continue, almost unchanged, one sunrise after another, as the Mediterranean gently breathed against the ancient Roman shore. As the morning slowly unfolded, the keeper made his way down the winding staircase that curved gently through the center of the lighthouse. The familiar stone steps had been worn smooth by many years of careful footsteps. He was certainly not the first man to climb them, nor would he be the last. Long before his arrival, Another keeper had followed the very same path each morning, and long after his own time had quietly passed, someone else would likely continue the same routine. There was something comforting about knowing that the work belonged not to one person, but to many generations. The staircase opened into a cool storage room deep within the lower part of the tower. Even on warm summer days, the thick stone walls kept this room pleasantly cool. The air carried a gentle mixture of familiar scents: dry timber, olive oil, old rope, sea salt, and the faint smell of smoke that seemed to live permanently inside every lighthouse. Wooden shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Everything had its proper place. Large clay jars stood quietly in neat rows. Some were filled with olive oil. Others contained resin collected from nearby pine forests. These materials helped the beacon burn brighter after sunset. Every drop was valuable. Every jar was counted. The keeper paused beside one of the largest amphorae. He placed both hands upon its rough clay surface for a moment, before carefully lifting the heavy lid. Inside, the olive oil reflected the narrow beam of sunlight, entering through a small window high in the wall. It shimmered softly, almost like liquid gold. He checked the level without hurry. There was still enough for many evenings. That was reassuring. Deliveries did not always arrive exactly when expected. The sea decided its own schedule. Strong winds could delay merchant ships for days, sometimes even weeks. Because of this, lighthouse keepers learned never to depend upon tomorrow's supplies. Instead, they cared carefully for what they already had. Nearby rested bundles of carefully stacked firewood. Each piece had been cut to a practical length. Some wood burned quickly, creating a bright flame. Other pieces burned more slowly, helping the beacon remain steady throughout the long hours of darkness. The keeper knew the difference without needing to think. Experience had quietly become knowledge. Knowledge had gently become instinct. He selected several pieces of wood and placed them into a woven basket. Beside them, he added small pieces of charcoal. Not too much, not too little, just enough. Everything inside the lighthouse followed a careful balance. Too much fuel could produce unnecessary smoke. Too little might allow the fire to weaken before dawn. The keeper had spent enough years beside the beacon to understand its quiet personality. Every fire behaved a little differently. Like the sea itself, no two nights were ever completely the same. After checking the fuel, he turned his attention to another important task: the ropes. Several thick coils rested neatly upon wooden pegs fixed securely into the stone wall. Some were used to lift supplies to the upper platform. Others secured equipment during stormy weather. Salt air slowly weakened natural fibers, so every rope required regular inspection. The keeper slowly passed one length of rope through his hands. His fingers searched patiently for frayed strands or signs of wear. He found only a few loose fibers. Nothing serious. Even so, he quietly marked the rope in his mind for replacement during the coming weeks. Small repairs prevented larger problems. It was a lesson repeated throughout every part of lighthouse life. Outside, the village had become busier. Soft sounds drifted through the open doorway. The rhythmic tapping of a carpenter's hammer. The distant voices of fishermen preparing their boats. The gentle clatter of clay jars being loaded onto a small cart. None of these sounds disturbed the peaceful atmosphere. Instead, they blended together like familiar notes in a quiet song that had been played for generations. Before returning upstairs, the keeper filled a small leather water flask from a covered clay vessel. Fresh water remained precious. Every cup was used thoughtfully, every drop respected. He took one slow drink, then stood silently for a moment. The lighthouse around him seemed almost alive, not because it moved, but because it breathed with the steady rhythm of daily life. Morning after morning, season after season, year after year, the tower asked for patience, and in return, it offered something that had become increasingly rare, even in the ancient world. A life lived without hurry. As the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, the sunlight began to soften across the coastline. The bright colors of midday quietly faded into gentle shades of gold. Long shadows stretched across the stone paths leading to the lighthouse. The sea, which had sparkled beneath the afternoon sun, now reflected a warmer light. Everything seemed to slow down. Even the wind became softer. The keeper knew this part of the day better than any other. It was the time when his most important work would soon begin. He carried the basket of carefully prepared firewood back up the winding staircase, step by step, without hurry. The familiar climb required little thought. His hands knew exactly where to steady themselves against the cool stone wall. His feet found each worn step almost automatically. At the top of the tower, the evening air felt different. The warmth of the day was beginning to disappear. A gentle breeze arrived from the open Mediterranean, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and distant rain somewhere far beyond the horizon. The keeper placed the basket beside the great bronze brazier. Before lighting the fire, he looked toward the sea one more time. Several merchant ships had appeared during the afternoon. From this distance they looked almost motionless. Their square sails caught the final light of the day, glowing softly beneath the setting sun. The sailors aboard those ships were likely preparing for another long night at sea. Some would be tired, some would be quietly talking together, others might simply be watching the sky, hoping for calm weather until morning. Most of them would never know the name of the man standing inside the lighthouse. Yet before long, they would depend upon his work. The keeper knelt beside the brazier. He arranged the smallest pieces of dry wood first, then slightly larger pieces. Finally, a few carefully chosen pieces of charcoal. Everything was placed with patience, not because it had to look beautiful, but because a well-built fire burned more steadily through the long hours of darkness. He reached for a small clay lamp that had remained lit since the morning. Shielding its tiny flame from the breeze with one hand, he carefully lowered it toward the waiting wood. For a few quiet moments, nothing happened. Then, a thin ribbon of smoke curled gently into the evening air. A tiny flame flickered softly, almost uncertain. The keeper waited. There was never any reason to rush a fire. Little by little, the flames grew stronger. The dry wood began to crackle quietly. Warm orange light spread across the stone platform. Soon the charcoal joined the fire, producing a steady glow that would remain visible far across the darkening sea. The beacon was awake once again. Night had not yet arrived, but it was ready. The keeper stood silently beside the fire for several moments. He watched the smoke rise into the evening sky. Above him, the first stars slowly began to appear. One, then another, then many more. The Mediterranean sky, free from the lights of modern cities, revealed countless stars stretching from one horizon to the other. It was a view few people in today's world ever experience. Below the tower, the small harbor was becoming quiet. Fishing boats returned one after another. Their crews tied ropes to weathered wooden posts. Soft conversations drifted across the calm water, before gradually fading into the evening. Windows inside the nearby village began to glow with the warm light of small oil lamps. Families gathered for simple meals, fresh bread, olives, cheese, perhaps a little fish caught earlier that day. Nothing extravagant, just familiar food shared at the end of another ordinary day. The keeper remained at his post. His evening meal would come later. For now, the fire required his attention. Every so often he added another carefully chosen piece of wood. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to keep the light strong and steady. This would continue for many hours. While most people slept peacefully inside their homes, the lighthouse keeper would remain awake, watching, waiting, quietly tending the fire that guided strangers safely through the darkness. He did not expect applause. No crowds would gather to thank him. No statues would ever be built in his honor. And yet, every ship that safely reached the harbor carried a small, unseen piece of his work. Perhaps that is why these forgotten lives still deserve to be remembered, not because they changed history with great victories, but because they quietly made ordinary life a little safer for countless people they would never meet. The fire continued to burn. The waves continued to roll gently against the shore. The stars slowly filled the Roman sky, and the lonely lighthouse stood exactly where it had always stood, patiently watching over the sea. The evening settled gently across the Mediterranean coast, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment when day became night. The final colors of the sunset slowly faded from gold into deep shades of blue, and then into a darkness softened by countless stars overhead. One by one, the familiar landmarks along the shoreline became little more than quiet silhouettes. The fishing boats had already returned. The voices from the harbor had grown fewer. Even the seabirds that had spent the day circling above the water now searched for sheltered places to rest until morning. Only the lighthouse remained fully awake. Its warm beacon glowed steadily above the coastline, casting a calm and reassuring light into the darkness. The keeper stood beside the fire, watching the flames with patient eyes. He had learned long ago that a beacon was never something to light and forget. A fire was almost like a living companion. It needed quiet attention, a little more wood at the right moment, a careful adjustment when the wind changed direction, a gentle removal of ash before it gathered too deeply. None of these tasks required great strength, only patience, and patience was something the keeper possessed in abundance. The breeze shifted slightly from the west. He noticed it immediately. Years beside the sea had taught him to recognize even the smallest changes in the air. The flames leaned gently toward the east before returning upright once again. Satisfied that the fire remained strong, he turned his attention toward the open water. Far beyond the harbor, tiny points of light appeared one after another. Some belonged to small fishing vessels finishing the last part of their journey home. Others marked the position of larger merchant ships that preferred to continue sailing through the cooler hours of the night. From the lighthouse, those distant lights seemed to drift slowly across the surface of the sea. Sometimes they disappeared behind gentle swells. Then, a few moments later, they quietly returned. There was something almost comforting about watching them. No sudden movements, no hurried pace, only steady progress across the dark water. The keeper often wondered where those ships had begun their journeys. Perhaps one had sailed from Alexandria many weeks earlier, carrying grain harvested beside the Nile. Another might have departed from the busy ports of Hispania, its cargo hold filled with olive oil, carefully sealed inside clay amphorae. A smaller vessel could have come from the islands of Greece, bringing fine pottery, woven cloth, or carefully carved wooden chests. Every ship carried not only goods, but also stories. Conversations shared between sailors, meals prepared beneath open skies, long days spent waiting for favorable winds, quiet moments watching dolphins swim beside the bow, letters tucked safely inside wooden boxes, gifts wrapped with care for families waiting far away. The keeper would never hear those stories. Yet, in a small and quiet way, he became part of every voyage. His fire did not choose who deserved guidance. It welcomed every traveler equally: merchant, fisherman, messenger, soldier returning home, or a young sailor seeing a familiar coastline after many months at sea. The light belonged to them all. He rested one hand against the warm stone surrounding the beacon. The tower itself seemed almost alive at night. The stones absorbed the heat of the fire. The breeze flowed gently through narrow openings. Soft shadows moved slowly across the ancient walls. Above him, the stars continued their silent journey across the heavens. Roman sailors often relied upon those stars when crossing open water. Long before compasses became common, experienced navigators learned to recognize familiar constellations. They watched the heavens with the same quiet attention that the lighthouse keeper gave to his fire. The sky became another map, one written not upon parchment, but across the endless darkness above. The keeper looked upward for a long moment. He recognized many of those same stars, not because he was an astronomer, simply because they had become familiar companions during countless peaceful nights beside the sea. Night after night, season after season, year after year, they always returned, never in a hurry, never demanding attention, simply appearing, as dependable as the tide itself. The sea answered with its own gentle rhythm. Small waves reached the rocky shore below. They broke softly against the stones, then slipped quietly back into the darkness, again and again. The sound had become so familiar that the keeper rarely noticed it anymore. Yet if the waves ever stopped, the silence would feel strangely empty. Some sounds become part of a place so completely that they almost disappear, not because they are gone, but because they have always been there. The lighthouse was much the same. For generations, its steady light had become an ordinary part of the coastline. Sailors expected to see it. Villagers expected it to shine. Children grew up believing the beacon had always watched over the harbor. Few people stopped to think about the quiet man who climbed the tower every evening to make sure that light never failed. And perhaps, the keeper preferred it that way. As the evening quietly deepened into night, the world around the lighthouse seemed to become even more peaceful. The last traces of twilight disappeared beyond the western horizon, leaving the Mediterranean beneath a sky filled with countless stars. The sea no longer reflected the warm colors of sunset. Instead, it carried gentle shades of deep blue and silver, illuminated only by the moon and the steady glow of the beacon. The keeper remained beside the fire. There was no clock to tell him the hour. There was little need for one. Time was measured differently here. It could be felt in the slow movement of the stars, in the changing direction of the wind, in the gradual cooling of the stone beneath his hands, and in the quiet rhythm of the fire itself. Every so often, he reached for another carefully chosen piece of wood. He placed it gently onto the glowing coals. The flames welcomed it without complaint. For a brief moment, the fire brightened. Then it settled once again into its familiar, steady glow. Nothing happened suddenly. Everything found its own calm pace. Far below, the harbor had fallen almost completely silent. The small fishing boats rested side by side, rising and falling with the gentle tide. Their ropes creaked softly against weathered wooden posts. The sound was faint, almost impossible to hear above the steady breathing of the sea. From one house in the village, a small oil lamp still burned behind a narrow window. Perhaps someone was finishing a late meal. Perhaps an elderly neighbor remained awake a little longer than usual. Or perhaps a parent quietly watched over a sleeping child. The keeper could only wonder. He had learned not to invent stories with certainty. Sometimes, simply wondering was enough. He slowly walked around the circular platform at the top of the lighthouse. Each step echoed gently against the ancient stone. The walls had listened to footsteps like these for many years. Every keeper had developed his own pace. Some walked a little faster. Others moved more slowly. But all of them shared the same quiet responsibility: to remain awake while others slept, to watch while others rested, to care for the light without expecting recognition. The breeze shifted again. This time it carried cooler air from the open sea. The keeper pulled his wool cloak a little closer around his shoulders. The fabric was thick and slightly rough, woven to provide warmth during long nights beside the coast. It had been repaired many times over the years. Small stitches crossed older patches where the cloth had worn thin. Like the lighthouse itself, the cloak remained useful because someone had cared for it patiently. Across the water, the moon cast a silver path upon the calm surface of the sea. The gentle light seemed almost to invite distant ships toward the shore. Sometimes the moon was full, sometimes only a thin crescent, sometimes hidden entirely behind clouds. But tonight it shone quietly, sharing the sky with countless stars. The keeper had seen this view so many times that he no longer searched for excitement within it. Instead, he appreciated its familiarity. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in knowing that tomorrow night's sky would be different in small ways, yet wonderfully familiar all the same. A faint sound reached his ears. Not loud, not alarming, simply different. He paused for a moment and listened carefully. It was the slow creaking of a merchant ship, adjusting gently to the movement of the tide as it waited beyond the harbor entrance. The sound traveled easily across the still water, wood against wood, rope against mast, quiet reminders that life continued beyond the lighthouse. The keeper smiled almost without noticing. He imagined tired sailors wrapped in wool blankets beneath the open sky. Some might already be asleep, others perhaps remained awake, taking turns watching the sea just as he watched the beacon. Although separated by distance, they shared the same peaceful night, the same moon, the same breeze, the same endless rhythm of the Mediterranean. For a little while, nothing changed. The fire burned steadily, the waves continued their patient conversation with the shore. The stars drifted slowly across the heavens. Even silence seemed content to remain exactly as it was. And perhaps that was the greatest gift the lighthouse offered. Not only safety, but reassurance. A steady light that appeared every evening without fail. A quiet promise waiting beside the sea, telling every traveler that home was never too far away. The keeper gently placed another piece of wood onto the glowing fire. A few tiny sparks floated upward into the cool night air. They rose only a short distance before disappearing into the darkness. For a brief moment, they looked almost like small stars returning to the sky. Then they were gone. The keeper watched them disappear. Then, as he had done countless times before, he quietly turned his eyes back toward the sea. The hours of the night continued to pass so quietly that it became almost impossible to notice the passage of time. Nothing announced the arrival of a new hour. There were no bells ringing across the harbor, no distant engines, no glowing clocks, only the patient rhythm of the sea. The keeper had come to appreciate these peaceful hours more than any other part of the day. The world seemed gentler after darkness settled over the coast. The harbor rested. The village slept. Even the wind appeared to speak more softly. He leaned lightly against the warm stone wall beside the beacon. The fire continued to burn with a calm, steady glow. Every few moments, a small piece of wood settled deeper into the bed of glowing charcoal. A quiet crackle followed. Then silence returned. The sound was never loud. It was simply another small reminder that the beacon remained alive. Below the tower, gentle waves continued their endless journey toward the shore. Each wave arrived with quiet patience. Each wave returned to the sea without complaint. No two waves were exactly alike. Yet together, they created a rhythm that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. Perhaps the people of ancient Rome found comfort in that rhythm. Perhaps they barely noticed it after hearing it every day of their lives. The keeper certainly no longer listened for individual waves. Instead, they blended together into a familiar background that accompanied every night he spent upon the tower. Sometimes he imagined that the sea itself was breathing, a slow breath toward the shore, a slow breath back into the darkness, in and out, again and again. The thought brought a quiet sense of peace. Far out upon the Mediterranean, a merchant ship continued its patient voyage. From the lighthouse, only a single lantern could be seen. It moved so slowly across the horizon that several minutes could pass before anyone noticed it had changed its position at all. Somewhere aboard that ship, sailors were likely taking turns keeping watch. One man may have stood near the bow, listening to the gentle splash of water against the wooden hull. Another may have rested beneath a wool blanket after many hours of work. Someone might have quietly looked toward the lighthouse and felt relieved to see its steady glow waiting beside the coast. The keeper would never know. Yet that uncertainty never troubled him. His task was not to meet the travelers. His task was simply to be there whenever they needed the light. There was something quietly beautiful about helping people without ever expecting to meet them. The lighthouse offered guidance to strangers. The keeper offered his time to people whose names he would never hear. Night after night, season after season, year after year, the work remained almost exactly the same. Occasionally, clouds drifted slowly across the moon. For a little while, the coastline grew darker. The silver path stretching across the sea gently faded. Only the warm light of the beacon remained constant. Then, just as quietly as they had arrived, the clouds continued on their journey. The moon returned. Its gentle light once again rested upon the water. Nothing dramatic had happened. The night had simply continued. The keeper welcomed these small changes. They reminded him that even peaceful nights were never completely still. The world was always moving, only very slowly. A cool breeze brushed against his face. He closed his eyes for just a moment. The air carried familiar scents. Salt from the sea, smoke from the beacon, fresh timber stored inside the tower, and somewhere far below, the faint aroma of bread that had been baked earlier in the evening. Even now, long after sunset, traces of ordinary life remained upon the night air. He opened his eyes once more. The stars had shifted slightly across the sky. Sailors often learned to read those movements with remarkable skill. The heavens became a silent guide, helping them travel across open water where no roads existed. The keeper admired that knowledge. His own understanding was simpler. He only needed to know enough to notice when the night remained calm, or when changing weather quietly approached from beyond the horizon. Experience had taught him that storms rarely arrived without warning. The wind spoke first. The sea answered second. The clouds completed the conversation. Tonight, all three remained peaceful. He gently added another small piece of wood to the fire. The flame welcomed it with quiet confidence. Tiny sparks floated upward for only a heartbeat before disappearing into the darkness above. For a brief moment, it was difficult to tell where the sparks ended and where the stars began. The keeper smiled softly. It was a thought he had probably had many times before, and perhaps he would quietly think it again tomorrow night. The night had now reached its quietest hours. For a long while, almost nothing had changed. The beacon continued to burn with the same gentle strength. The sea continued its slow conversation with the shore, and above it all, the stars followed their ancient paths across the sky, just as they had long before the lighthouse was built, and just as they would long after it had become nothing more than weathered stone. The keeper stood quietly beside the fire. He was never truly alone. The sea was always present. The wind never wandered too far away. The fire spoke in its own quiet language, with soft crackles and gentle waves of warmth rising into the cool night air. These companions asked nothing from him. They simply remained. Over many years, he had become familiar with every small sound the lighthouse could make. The wooden door sometimes gave a gentle sigh when the wind changed direction. The stone walls released the warmth they had gathered during the day. The iron frame surrounding the beacon expanded ever so slightly while the fire burned brightly, then cooled again as the hours passed. None of these sounds were surprising. They belonged to the lighthouse just as surely as the stones themselves. Far below, the tide had begun to rise. The waves reached a little farther onto the rocky shore, before quietly slipping back into the darkness. If someone listened carefully, they might notice the difference. The rhythm remained the same, only the distance had changed. Nature often worked that way. Small changes, gentle changes, changes that rewarded patience rather than hurried attention. The keeper appreciated those quiet differences. They reminded him that even the calmest places were never completely still. The world was always moving, only very slowly. A faint cloud crossed the face of the moon. For a few peaceful moments, the sea became darker, the coastline softened into shadow. Only the beacon remained bright, casting its familiar glow across the water. Somewhere in the distance, a merchant captain may have lifted his eyes and recognized that comforting light. He would know that land was near, that the harbor was not far away, that another day of sailing was gently coming to an end. The keeper would never hear the captain's quiet relief. He did not need to. The light itself carried the message. It always had. It always would. He carefully adjusted one final piece of wood upon the glowing fire. The flames welcomed it without hurry. The beacon answered with the same warm light it had offered all evening. Reliable, steady, patient, the qualities that mattered most were often the quietest ones. As the hours continued, the keeper found himself thinking about the many men who had stood here before him. Perhaps decades earlier, another keeper had leaned against this very same stone wall. He had watched these same stars. He had listened to these same waves. He had tended this same fire with the same careful hands. History had forgotten his name, but it had not forgotten his work. The lighthouse remained because ordinary people had quietly cared for it, one evening after another, without seeking praise. Perhaps that is how much of history truly survives. Not through great speeches, not through famous victories, but through countless ordinary people who simply completed their work with patience and care. A baker preparing tomorrow's bread, a fisherman repairing his nets, a potter shaping another clay jar, a mother mending worn clothing by the light of a small oil lamp, and here, a lighthouse keeper making certain that one more fire continued to burn through the night. Each task appeared small, yet together they allowed communities to live peacefully. The keeper lifted his eyes once more toward the open sea. The horizon had almost disappeared into the darkness. Sea and sky now blended together so completely that only the stars revealed where one ended and the other began. It was a beautiful uncertainty, gentle, endless, calm. He took one slow breath of the cool Mediterranean air. The familiar scent of salt mixed with warm smoke filled his lungs. It was a scent that had become part of his life. Perhaps, after many years, he could no longer imagine home without it. The fire burned quietly beside him. The waves continued below, the stars continued above, and the lighthouse continued exactly as it always had, patiently watching, quietly guiding, never asking to be remembered. The night continued without asking for attention. By now, the lighthouse had almost disappeared from sight. Not because it was no longer standing, but because there was very little reason to look at it anymore. For those resting comfortably at home, for those listening beside a warm fire, or for those slowly drifting toward sleep, the story no longer needed pictures. The quiet rhythm of the sea could now paint its own gentle images inside the mind. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the lighthouse keeper remained at his familiar post. The fire still burned. The waves still reached the shore. The stars still crossed the Roman sky with patient certainty. Nothing hurried them, nothing interrupted their ancient journey. The keeper rested both hands upon the smooth stone wall that surrounded the beacon. The warmth of the fire gently balanced the cool air arriving from the Mediterranean. It was a feeling he had experienced thousands of times. Even so, he never seemed to grow tired of it. There are some moments in life that remain comforting simply because they never try to become extraordinary. This was one of those moments. Far below, the sleeping village rested beneath the quiet protection of darkness. Most windows had become completely dark. Only here and there, a single oil lamp still glowed softly behind a wooden shutter. Perhaps an elderly woman remained awake, carefully spinning wool before finally going to bed. Perhaps a fisherman had risen early to prepare his nets before the coming dawn. Or perhaps someone simply sat quietly beside a fading fire, listening to the same waves that reached the lighthouse. The keeper would never know. The night carried many quiet stories, most of them remained untold, and perhaps they always would. A gentle wind crossed the platform. It carried the familiar scent of salt, smoke, and cool stone. The keeper breathed deeply. After so many years beside the sea, he could almost tell the seasons simply by the feeling of the air. Winter brought sharper winds that traveled unhindered across the water. Spring carried the faint scent of fresh plants growing along the cliffs. Summer offered warm evenings that seemed reluctant to end. Autumn often arrived quietly, bringing cooler nights and softer skies. Tonight felt peaceful, balanced, comfortable. The fire required only a little attention now. Every so often, the keeper gently moved a glowing piece of charcoal with a long iron rod. Not because anything was wrong, only because steady fires appreciated gentle care. The small adjustment sent a handful of glowing sparks drifting upward. For a brief moment, they rose through the darkness like tiny golden stars. Then they quietly disappeared. The keeper watched them until they were gone. He wondered how many thousands of sparks he had seen during his years upon the tower. Certainly more than anyone could ever count. Yet each one lasted only a heartbeat. Some things were beautiful precisely because they stayed for such a short time. Above him, the stars offered the opposite lesson. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, they returned with remarkable patience. The same constellations had guided sailors long before Rome became an empire. They would continue shining long after these stones had slowly returned to the earth. The keeper found quiet comfort in that thought. His own life was only a small part of a much longer story. He did not need to accomplish extraordinary things. He only needed to tend the fire faithfully during the years entrusted to him. Sometimes, that was enough. He looked toward the sea once again. The horizon had completely disappeared. Sea and sky had become one endless darkness. Only the beacon created a gentle point of certainty, a warm light, steady, reliable, waiting for anyone who might need it. Perhaps that is why people have always been drawn to simple lights in the darkness. A candle in a quiet room, a lantern beside a lonely road, a small fire shared among travelers, or a lighthouse standing patiently beside the sea. They remind us that someone cared enough to keep the light alive, and that thought alone can make even the darkest night feel just a little less lonely. By this hour of the night, the world felt wonderfully unhurried. The busiest moments of the day had long since passed. The fishermen had returned home. The merchants had closed their storehouses. The children of the village were deeply asleep beneath warm wool blankets. Even the dogs that had wandered the narrow streets earlier in the evening had found quiet places to rest. Only a few people remained awake. Among them was the lighthouse keeper. He had long ago accepted that his days followed a different rhythm from most others. While the village welcomed sleep, he welcomed the night. There was no feeling of loneliness in that arrangement. Instead, there was a quiet sense of purpose. Someone needed to watch the sea while everyone else rested. Someone needed to keep the fire alive until the first light of morning appeared beyond the eastern horizon. And tonight, as on so many nights before, that responsibility belonged to him. The keeper slowly walked once around the circular platform. His footsteps were soft against the ancient stone. He knew every part of this tower so well that he could almost find his way with his eyes closed. There was a slight dip in one step near the northern side. A small crack beside one of the narrow windows. A place where the sea wind always seemed just a little cooler. These tiny details had become as familiar as the lines upon his own hands. Perhaps this was what happened when someone spent many years in the same place. The building slowly became part of the person, and the person quietly became part of the building. He paused beside the beacon and looked into the heart of the glowing fire. The bright flames danced gently above a bed of warm charcoal. They moved without hurry, never exactly repeating the same shape twice, yet always remaining calm. Watching a fire required very little effort. There was no mystery to solve, no hidden meaning to uncover, only light, warmth, and time passing one quiet moment after another. The keeper often found himself thinking during these peaceful hours, not about great questions, not about fame or fortune. His thoughts were usually much simpler. He wondered whether the olive trees on the hillside would produce a good harvest that year. He hoped that the fishermen had returned safely before darkness settled across the coast. He thought about a loaf of fresh bread he might collect from the village tomorrow. Sometimes he remembered people he had known many years earlier, a father who had taught him patience, an older keeper who had shown him how to judge the wind by watching the surface of the sea, a neighbor who always greeted him with the same warm smile whenever he visited the marketplace. These memories arrived quietly. They stayed for a little while. Then they drifted away like clouds crossing the moon. The keeper never tried to hold on to them. He simply welcomed them when they came. Far out across the Mediterranean, the sea continued its endless movement. Even on the calmest nights, the water was never completely still. Gentle swells rolled across the open sea, traveling great distances before finally reaching the shore. Some of those waves had begun their journey many miles away, perhaps beyond another island, perhaps beyond another coast entirely. By the time they reached the lighthouse, they had become little more than soft whispers against the rocks below. The keeper liked to imagine how far those waters had traveled. The Roman world was connected by the sea. Ships carried grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, marble from Greece. Letters crossed the Mediterranean, ideas crossed with them, languages mixed together in busy ports. Yet here, beside this quiet lighthouse, all of that distant activity felt wonderfully far away. The keeper's world was much smaller: a tower, a fire, a stretch of coastline, the changing sky above, and the patient sea below. Some people might have called such a life ordinary. The keeper might have agreed. But ordinary did not mean empty. There was quiet richness in familiar routines. There was comfort in recognizing every stone of the tower. There was satisfaction in seeing the beacon burn steadily through another peaceful night. The hours passed almost unnoticed. The moon climbed a little higher. The stars slowly changed their places. The fire settled gently before brightening again as another piece of wood was carefully added. Nothing asked to be remembered. Nothing demanded attention. The night simply continued, calmly, patiently, just as it had for countless generations before. And the lighthouse keeper continued with it, tending his quiet flame beneath the endless Roman sky. There comes a quiet hour in every night, when the world feels almost suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. It is a time that many people sleep through without ever noticing. The roads remain empty. The village is silent. Even the sea seems to breathe a little more gently than before. The lighthouse keeper had always been fond of this hour, not because anything remarkable happened. Quite the opposite. Very little happened at all. The fire burned with a calm and dependable glow. The waves rolled patiently beneath the cliffs. The stars continued their slow journey across the heavens. Nothing asked to be hurried. Nothing expected to change. The keeper rested on a simple wooden stool near the beacon. It was not a place for long sleep, only for quiet moments of rest while his eyes remained upon the fire. The stool had served many keepers before him. Its wooden legs had been repaired more than once. The smooth surface had been polished by countless years of careful use. Like nearly everything inside the lighthouse, it had earned its place through quiet usefulness rather than beauty. He placed another small piece of wood upon the glowing coals. The flames welcomed it gently. A soft crackling sound rose into the cool night air before fading once again into silence. The keeper listened, not because he feared the silence, but because silence itself often revealed the smallest sounds. The distant splash of a fish breaking the surface, the gentle flutter of wings as a night bird crossed the coastline, the whisper of wind passing through dry grass upon the cliffs, the slow creak of timber from a fishing boat resting peacefully inside the harbor. Each sound arrived alone. Each one faded naturally. None of them disturbed the calm. Instead, they became part of it. Far beyond the reach of the beacon, the Mediterranean stretched into darkness. Its waters connected distant provinces of the Roman world. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another lighthouse keeper might have been standing beside another fire. Perhaps on the coast of Sicily, perhaps near Alexandria, perhaps along the shores of Hispania. Though they would never meet, they shared the same quiet duty. Each tended a flame. Each watched the sea. Each trusted that steady work, repeated night after night, was worthwhile. The keeper found comfort in that thought. He was not entirely alone. Across the vast coastline of the empire, other ordinary men were quietly doing the same work beneath the same stars. The night breeze shifted ever so slightly. It brushed across the beacon before winding gently around the tower. The keeper noticed the change almost without thinking. Experience had taught him that every breeze carried its own character. Some arrived dry after crossing warm hills, others carried cool moisture from the open sea. Tonight, the wind remained soft and steady. There would likely be no storm before sunrise. That was welcome news for any sailor still making his way across the water. The keeper lifted his eyes toward the eastern horizon. It was still dark, yet if someone watched with enough patience, they might notice that the deepest black of the sky had begun to soften ever so slightly. Dawn was still far away, but night had quietly begun its journey toward morning. The change was almost impossible to see from one moment to the next. Only those who spent long hours beneath the open sky learned to recognize it. The keeper smiled to himself. He had learned that many of life's greatest changes happened this way, slowly, silently, without announcement. A child becoming an adult, a young tree growing into a great olive tree, stone becoming smooth beneath many years of wind and rain, or a man becoming wise without ever noticing the exact day it happened. The lighthouse had taught him patience. The sea had taught him humility. The stars had taught him that every journey unfolds at its own pace. There was no benefit in rushing what time would complete on its own. He reached once more for the iron poker and gently settled the burning logs into a more comfortable position. The flames responded with a warm glow. Tiny sparks drifted upward, disappearing into the darkness almost as quickly as they appeared. The keeper watched them with quiet satisfaction. Then he returned to his familiar place beside the beacon. The fire continued to burn, the sea continued to breathe, the night continued to unfold, and the ancient lighthouse stood exactly as it always had, steady, patient, and quietly faithful to its purpose. As the longest hours of the night quietly slipped by, the lighthouse keeper sensed a change that was almost impossible to see. The darkness had not disappeared, the stars had not faded, the sea still rested beneath the night, and yet, something was gently different. The eastern horizon held the faintest suggestion of light, not enough to brighten the water, not enough to cast a shadow, only enough to remind those who remained awake that another morning was slowly making its way across the world. The keeper did not greet the dawn with excitement. After so many years beside the sea, sunrise had become an old and trusted companion. It always arrived in its own time, never early, never late, never asking for applause. He stepped quietly around the beacon once more. The fire had burned faithfully throughout the night. Its bright flames had softened into a bed of glowing coals surrounded by gentle tongues of amber light. The warmth rising from the brazier felt pleasant against the cool morning air. He reached for another small piece of seasoned wood, not because the fire demanded it urgently, but because he understood its quiet rhythm. A well-tended beacon was built from countless small decisions, each one almost too ordinary to remember. Together, they carried ships safely home. The sea remained calm. Small waves continued to fold themselves gently against the rocks below. Each wave sounded almost identical to the one before it, yet none of them were truly the same. The keeper had often thought that people were much like the sea. From a distance, generations appeared to repeat themselves. Children grew into adults. Parents became grandparents. Old faces quietly disappeared while new ones took their place. Life seemed wonderfully familiar, and yet every person carried a story that belonged only to them. History rarely wrote those stories down. It preferred emperors, victories, monuments, treaties, but the Roman world had also been built by countless ordinary hands, hands that kneaded bread before sunrise, hands that repaired fishing nets beneath the afternoon sun, hands that copied books by the quiet light of oil lamps, hands that carved stone, planted olive trees, wove warm wool into blankets, and hands that quietly placed another piece of wood upon a lighthouse fire. Without those ordinary hands, even great empires would have struggled to endure. The keeper looked once more toward the harbor. The village still slept peacefully. Thin curls of smoke had not yet begun to rise from the chimneys. The fishing boats rested exactly where they had been tied the evening before. The sea patiently waited for another day's work to begin. There was something deeply reassuring about familiar mornings. The world did not need to become new every day. Sometimes it was enough simply to continue, to repeat the work that mattered, to care for the people around you in quiet ways that often passed unnoticed. The lighthouse had taught this lesson better than any philosopher. Its purpose never changed. It did not seek attention. It did not ask to be admired. It simply offered light whenever darkness arrived. The keeper gently brushed a little ash from the edge of the brazier. The motion was slow, almost effortless. He had repeated it so many thousands of times that his hands seemed to remember the movement without needing instruction. Routine, he had discovered, was not the enemy of a peaceful life. Routine could become its foundation. It created space for quiet thoughts, for careful observation, for gratitude towards simple things that hurried lives often overlooked. A warm cloak on a cool night, fresh bread shared with neighbors, the comforting sound of waves meeting the shore, the glow of a steady fire, the sight of distant stars returning to the same places each season. These were modest gifts, yet together they formed a rich life. The first birds of morning had not yet begun their songs. The harbor remained wrapped in gentle silence. The keeper welcomed those final quiet moments before the world slowly awakened. He knew that soon the fishermen would prepare their boats once again, merchants would open their warehouses, children would run along the narrow streets. The ordinary rhythm of another Roman day would begin, but for now, the night still belonged to him. He stood beside the beacon in peaceful silence. The fire glowed steadily, the sea breathed softly, the stars slowly faded as the first pale color touched the eastern sky. Another night had passed. Not with great adventures, not with dramatic events, simply with faithful work completed exactly as it had been for generations, and perhaps that quiet faithfulness was more remarkable than history often allowed itself to remember. The keeper smiled gently. Then he turned once more toward the sea. ready to welcome another ordinary day beside the lighthouse. Morning arrived so gradually that, for a long while, the lighthouse keeper could only sense it rather than see it. The stars slowly surrendered their place in the sky. One after another, they faded into the growing light without ceremony. The beacon, which had been the brightest light upon the coastline throughout the night, now shared the morning with the rising sun. The keeper looked into the fire one last time before beginning the familiar task of letting it rest. He never extinguished it carelessly. Even this final duty was performed with patience. Using a long iron rod, he gently separated the glowing coals. Fresh air reached them for only a moment before he carefully spread a thin layer of ash across their surface. The bright flames quietly settled. The glowing embers softened into a gentle warmth. By evening, some of those coals might still help awaken another fire. Nothing useful was wasted. That lesson had been passed from one keeper to the next for many years. When supplies traveled slowly across the Roman world, careful hands mattered more than abundant ones. The keeper remained beside the brazier for another quiet moment. A faint ribbon of smoke rose into the cool morning air. It drifted toward the sea before disappearing completely. The work of the night had come to its peaceful end. Another ordinary watch had been completed. He felt no excitement, no great sense of achievement, only quiet satisfaction. Sometimes the most meaningful work leaves behind very little noise. He slowly descended the spiral staircase. The stone steps were cool beneath his sandals. Morning light entered through the narrow windows, painting long rectangles across the ancient walls. Dust floated gently through the beams of sunlight. Each tiny particle moved so slowly that it seemed almost suspended in time. The keeper paused beside one of the windows. From there he could see the village beginning to wake. A thin trail of smoke curled upward from the first chimney. Not long after, another appeared. Then another. Breakfast fires were being lit throughout the settlement. Soon the familiar smell of fresh bread would drift across the hillside. Children would begin rubbing the sleep from their eyes. Doors would open. Voices would return to the narrow streets. But for now, everything remained wonderfully quiet. He continued toward the lower storeroom. The heavy wooden door gave its familiar creak as it opened. Inside, the cool air welcomed him. Clay jars stood exactly where they had been placed the previous afternoon. Bundles of seasoned wood rested neatly against the wall. Coils of rope hung from sturdy pegs. Nothing had moved. The room seemed almost untouched by time. The keeper preferred it that way. Order brought calm. When every tool had its place, the mind itself seemed to grow quieter. He lifted one of the oil jars and carried it to a simple wooden table. Removing the lid, he carefully inspected its contents. The level had fallen only slightly after another night of feeding the beacon. There would be enough for many evenings yet. Even so, he marked the change in his memory. Not upon parchment, not with ink, simply in the quiet habit of observation. He trusted his memory because he had trained it through years of repetition. Every evening added another small lesson. Every morning quietly confirmed what had been learned before. Outside, the breeze carried the scent of damp grass mixed with the salt of the sea. Somewhere nearby, a rooster greeted the morning. Its call echoed gently across the cliffs before fading into the distance. The keeper smiled. It was one of the few sounds that always reminded him the long night was finally over. He poured himself a cup of cool water from a covered clay vessel. The water tasted fresh, simple, clean. There was a quiet pleasure in ordinary things. A drink after many hours of work. Warm sunlight reaching cold stone. The feeling of tired muscles after honest labor. Perhaps happiness was often found in such small moments, not because they were rare, but because they quietly returned day after day. The keeper carried his cup outside. He sat upon a smooth stone near the base of the lighthouse. For the first time since sunset, his work allowed a few peaceful moments of rest. Before him, the Mediterranean stretched peacefully beneath the growing morning light. Fishing boats slowly prepared to leave the harbor. Their sails remained lowered for now. Men greeted one another with familiar voices. A dog wandered lazily along the shoreline. Somewhere, a baker opened the door of a warm oven. Life was beginning again. Almost exactly as it had yesterday, almost exactly as it would tomorrow. The keeper watched without speaking. There was nothing to add, nothing to interrupt. The world seemed perfectly content to continue at its own gentle pace. And beside the quiet sea, so was he. The morning settled comfortably over the coastline, bringing with it a gentle warmth that slowly replaced the cool air of the night. The lighthouse keeper remained seated upon the smooth stone outside the tower. There was no urgency waiting for him. His watch had ended. The next fire would not need to be lit until evening. For a little while, he allowed himself the simple pleasure of watching another ordinary Roman day begin. The harbour gradually became more active, not suddenly, but little by little. A fisherman untied the ropes holding his small wooden boat. Another carefully inspected a woven net that had been repaired only a few days before. Nearby, two brothers worked together without speaking very much. One folded a square sail while the other checked a bundle of rope. They had performed these same tasks together for so many years that conversation was hardly necessary. Their hands understood the routine better than words ever could. The keeper often admired such quiet cooperation. Across the Roman world, countless people depended upon one another in simple ways. The potter relied upon the clay gatherer. The baker relied upon the miller. The miller relied upon the farmer. The sailor relied upon the shipbuilder. And, on nights when darkness covered the sea, many of them quietly relied upon the steady light of the lighthouse. Most would never meet. Many would never know one another's names. Yet together they formed an invisible chain of careful work. Each person completed one small task. Together those tasks became the peaceful rhythm of everyday life. The keeper found comfort in that thought. He had never considered himself an important man. His work was modest. His days were predictable. His name would probably never appear in the records kept by Roman officials. Yet every ordinary evening spent tending the beacon became one small part of something much larger than himself. The morning breeze carried the comforting smell of fresh bread from the village. The bakery had almost certainly been awake long before sunrise. Bread did not appear by accident. Grain had first been harvested beneath the summer sun, then dried, stored, ground into flour, mixed patiently with water, kneaded by experienced hands, allowed time to rise, finally baked inside warm stone ovens. Even a simple loaf carried within it the quiet work of many people. The keeper appreciated that, perhaps because his own work followed the same pattern. Small actions repeated carefully, little by little, day after day, until something dependable was created. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. The sea remained the loudest voice along the coast. Gentle waves reached the shore with the same calm rhythm they had offered throughout the night. Above them came softer sounds, the distant laughter of children beginning another day, the slow turning of a cartwheel over a stone road, the quiet tapping of a carpenter shaping fresh timber, a flock of sheep moving across the hillside, their small bells ringing gently as they searched for new grass. None of these sounds competed with one another. They simply shared the morning. The keeper had learned that peaceful places were often filled with gentle sounds. Silence did not always mean complete stillness. Sometimes silence was simply the absence of hurry. He opened his eyes and watched a pair of gulls gliding effortlessly above the harbour. They rarely flapped their wings. Instead, they trusted the breeze to carry them where they wished to go. The keeper smiled softly. He wondered if people sometimes worked too hard against the natural rhythm of life. The sea never rushed toward the shore. The seasons never hurried from spring to summer. The sun never raced across the sky. Everything arrived when its time had come. Perhaps people found greater peace when they accepted that same gentle rhythm. Nearby, an elderly fisherman sat repairing a worn fishing net. His movements were slow but remarkably steady, one knot after another, one careful loop after another. There was no sign of frustration, no attempt to finish quickly. The work itself seemed to provide its own quiet satisfaction. The keeper had seen that fisherman for many years. His beard had gradually turned from dark brown to silver. His hands had become rougher. His back bent a little more each passing season. Yet every morning he still sat beside the harbour with the same familiar patience. Time changed people gently, almost so gently that they rarely noticed it happening. The lighthouse keeper understood that feeling well. When he had first climbed the tower as a young apprentice, every task had required careful thought. He had counted each step of the spiral staircase. He had worried about feeding the fire correctly. He had watched the weather with uncertain eyes. Now, after many years, those same tasks had become as natural as breathing. Wisdom had not arrived in a single moment. It had gathered quietly, one ordinary evening at a time. Perhaps that was the way true knowledge always grew, not in sudden discoveries, but in countless peaceful repetitions that slowly shaped both the hands and the heart. The keeper remained beneath the warm morning sun for a little while longer. There was nowhere else he needed to be, nothing else demanding his attention. The sea stretched peacefully before him. The village carried on with another familiar day, and the lighthouse stood behind him, waiting patiently for another evening to arrive. As the morning continued, the warmth of the sun slowly spread across the ancient stones of the lighthouse. The tower, which had felt cool beneath the stars only a few hours earlier, now gently absorbed the growing light. The keeper placed one hand upon the familiar wall. The stone was beginning to feel warm again. It was another quiet reminder that every day followed its own patient circle. Night gave way to morning. Morning slowly welcomed the afternoon. The afternoon would eventually soften into evening, and once again, the lighthouse would prepare for another peaceful watch. There was comfort in knowing that some rhythms never needed to be changed. The keeper rose from his resting place and began a slow walk around the base of the tower. Although the night's work had ended, there were always small tasks waiting to be done. He examined the stone walls with careful eyes. Here and there, tiny patches of moss had begun to appear where the sea air remained damp. A few loose pebbles had gathered near the entrance after yesterday's wind. Nothing required immediate attention. Still, he quietly brushed the path clean with a simple broom made from dried reeds. The task was slow, almost meditative. Each gentle sweep moved only a little dust. Yet after many careful strokes, the entrance once again looked orderly. The keeper believed that even small acts of care were worthwhile. Few visitors would notice whether the path had been swept. Fewer still would think about who had done it. But the lighthouse deserved respect. It had stood faithfully beside the sea through countless seasons. Looking after it felt less like work and more like returning a kindness. Nearby, several wild flowers had found space to grow between the rocks. Their roots reached into tiny cracks where a little soil had gathered over many years. The keeper paused to admire them. No one had planted them. No gardener visited this lonely place. The wind had carried their seeds. The rain had provided enough water. The sun had quietly done the rest. Nature often worked with remarkable patience. Nothing seemed hurried. Nothing appeared forced. The flowers bloomed because the season had arrived. When autumn came, they would gently fade away. Next spring, others would quietly take their place. The keeper accepted this peaceful rhythm without sadness. Change had always belonged to the natural world. The sea changed with every tide. The sky changed with every season. Even the strongest stone slowly changed beneath years of wind and rain. Yet somehow, the lighthouse remained. Not unchanged, but carefully maintained. That small difference mattered. Nothing lasts forever without gentle attention. The keeper understood this better than most. He stepped into the small storeroom once again. The scent of dry timber welcomed him. Bundles of firewood rested neatly against the wall, stacked according to size. The thickest logs would be saved for cold winter nights. Smaller branches would help awaken the evening fire. Even the smallest pieces were kept. They would prove useful someday. Waste was uncommon in places where every resource had traveled a long journey. The keeper selected a few pieces of wood and carried them outside. He placed them beneath a simple wooden shelter where the sea breeze could continue drying them. The work required no great effort, only steady hands, only time. He found that many worthwhile tasks shared those same quiet requirements. As he finished arranging the wood, he looked toward the harbor once more. The fishing boats had now disappeared beyond the headland. Only their white sails remained visible for a little while before blending into the bright morning sky. Some would return before sunset, others might stay upon the water until evening. Their lives followed the movement of the sea, just as his own followed the coming and going of daylight. Different routines, the same quiet dedication. The keeper often wondered whether the fishermen thought about the lighthouse during the day. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps they simply expected the beacon to be waiting when darkness returned. That thought never troubled him. The finest work is often the work that becomes so dependable it is almost invisible. People notice the light only when it is absent. They notice the shelter only during rain. They notice fresh water only when the well runs dry. Until then, ordinary things quietly serve everyone without asking to be admired. The keeper smiled gently at the thought. There was peace in living such a life built upon reliability rather than recognition. He looked toward the endless Mediterranean one more time. The water sparkled beneath the late morning sun. Small waves continued their endless journey toward the shore, just as they had yesterday, just as they would tomorrow. And somewhere beyond the distant horizon, another lighthouse keeper was almost certainly beginning his own quiet morning, following many of the same routines beneath another stretch of Roman sky. For a moment, although separated by many miles of open water, they seemed connected by something simple. Not by words, not by letters, but by shared habits, shared patience, and the quiet satisfaction of caring faithfully for a light that guided others home. By the time the morning had settled fully over the coastline, the lighthouse had become simply another quiet part of the landscape. Its tall stone walls no longer stood against the darkness. Instead, they rested peacefully beneath the gentle light of the Mediterranean sun. From a distance, travelers might have seen only an old tower overlooking the sea. Few would have guessed how much quiet work had taken place there during the night. The keeper welcomed that quiet anonymity. His purpose had never been to draw attention to himself. The light had always been meant for others. Now that daylight had returned, the sea no longer depended upon the beacon. The sun had taken over that gentle responsibility. Ships could follow the shape of the coastline once again. The cliffs were clearly visible. The harbour entrance could easily be recognized. For a few peaceful hours, the lighthouse could simply rest. The keeper stepped slowly along the narrow path that circled the tower. Wild grasses moved gently in the sea breeze. Small white flowers nodded quietly beneath the morning light. Tiny insects drifted lazily from one blossom to another, following routines older than memory itself. Everything seemed to know its place. Everything seemed content to move at its own unhurried pace. He paused beside the edge of the cliff and looked out across the water. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface broken only by the slow movement of distant sails. From this height, the sea appeared almost perfectly calm. Only the sunlight revealed the gentle rise and fall of the waves. It reminded him that many things appeared still from far away, even though they were quietly alive with movement. The same could be said of the lighthouse. Visitors saw only stone. The keeper saw years of careful maintenance. They saw a tower. He saw thousands of evenings, each one beginning with the simple act of preparing a fire. Perhaps every familiar place carried two histories, one that everyone noticed, and another known only by the people who quietly cared for it. The keeper thought about the many seasons that had passed beneath this tower. He remembered winters when the sea wind whistled through every narrow opening. He remembered peaceful summers when the evenings remained warm long after sunset. He remembered autumn mornings scented with damp earth after gentle rain. He remembered spring, when tiny green plants appeared between the rocks almost overnight. Each season brought small differences, yet none disturbed the quiet purpose of the lighthouse. Night always returned. The fire always waited. The work quietly continued. The keeper found comfort in knowing that life did not need constant change to remain meaningful. Sometimes meaning grew from repetition, from familiar paths, from well-used tools, from ordinary mornings that resembled the ones before them. There was a quiet kind of happiness in recognizing the same sound of waves each day, the same stone steps beneath his sandals, the same breeze arriving from the sea. These simple things asked for nothing, yet they gave much in return. The sun climbed a little higher. Its warmth settled across the tower, drying the last traces of moisture left by the cool night air. The keeper noticed a small lizard resting upon one of the sunlit stones. It remained perfectly still for several moments before quietly disappearing into a narrow crack in the wall. He smiled softly. Even the smallest creatures had found a place beside the lighthouse. Life gathered wherever peace could be found. The morning continued without hurry. Somewhere below, the sound of gentle conversation drifted upward from the harbor. Fishermen preparing their boats, merchants arranging baskets, neighbors exchanging familiar greetings. None of the voices sounded rushed. There was still plenty of daylight ahead. Rome's great cities were often remembered for their busy streets and crowded markets. But along this quiet stretch of coastline, life followed a gentler rhythm. People measured the day by the sun overhead, the tide along the shore, and the changing color of the sky. The keeper quietly preferred it that way. He believed that people noticed more when they lived slowly. The smell of fresh bread, the warmth of smooth stone, the distant sound of waves meeting the cliffs, the changing direction of the wind. These small details often disappeared when life became hurried. Yet here, there was time to notice them all. He took one slow breath. The familiar scent of salt filled the air. The lighthouse stood silently behind him. The sea stretched endlessly before him. Between them stood one ordinary man, whose quiet work had guided countless strangers through the darkness. Few would ever know his name. Fewer still would remember his face. But perhaps that was never the purpose. Perhaps the greatest acts of care are the ones that leave no signature behind, the ones completed faithfully, patiently, and without expectation of praise. The keeper turned back toward the tower. Even though the next watch would not begin until evening, there were always small preparations to make, a little wood to arrange, a few tools to inspect, a doorway to sweep. Nothing difficult, nothing urgent. Only another collection of simple tasks waiting to be completed with calm hands and an unhurried heart. And so the peaceful rhythm continued. One quiet morning becoming another, one ordinary day gently following the last, just as it had beside this Roman lighthouse for generations beyond counting. The days passed quietly along the Roman coastline, not one day exactly the same as another, yet similar enough that they gently blended together in memory. If someone had asked the lighthouse keeper about a particular Tuesday from 3 summers ago, he probably would not have remembered it, not because it lacked importance, but because peaceful lives are often made from countless ordinary days rather than a handful of extraordinary ones. Each evening began almost the same way. Long before the sun touched the horizon, the keeper climbed the familiar spiral staircase. His sandals found each worn stone step without hesitation. He no longer counted them. His feet remembered the journey better than his thoughts ever needed to. The climb itself had become a quiet meditation. One step, then another, neither fast nor slow, simply steady. At the top of the tower, the Mediterranean welcomed him with its endless horizon. Some evenings the sea reflected bright sunlight until the very last moment. Other evenings a gentle mist softened the distant coastline. Occasionally thin clouds painted long shadows across the water. No two sunsets were completely alike, yet all of them arrived with the same patient certainty. The keeper never hurried to prepare the beacon. He believed that careful work began with calm hands. Before touching the firewood, he spent a few quiet moments looking across the sea. He watched the fishing boats making their final return. He observed the color of the waves. He noticed the direction of the evening breeze. These simple observations were never wasted. The sea often revealed tomorrow's weather to those willing to watch patiently. He knelt beside the stack of carefully seasoned wood. Each log had been drying for many months beneath a simple shelter beside the tower. Fresh wood created too much smoke. Damp wood burned unevenly. Only well-seasoned timber produced the bright, dependable flame that sailors expected to see. Choosing the right pieces became an important part of the evening. The keeper lifted each log with quiet care, not because it was heavy, but because every piece of wood represented time. Months of drying beneath the Roman sun. Months of protection from unexpected rain. Months of waiting for this very evening. Patience had already been invested long before the fire was ever lit. Perhaps that was true of many worthwhile things. Good bread required patient baking. Strong ships required careful building. Healthy olive trees required years of quiet growth. And a reliable lighthouse depended upon wood that had learned to wait. Nearby rested several clay jars filled with lamp oil. The keeper inspected each one before sunset. He gently removed the lids and checked the level inside. The oil shimmered softly in the fading light. Everything appeared ready for another peaceful night. There was satisfaction in careful preparation. When evening finally arrived, there would be no need to rush. The work would unfold naturally, exactly as it always had. A gentle breeze crossed the platform. It carried the scent of salt mixed with warm earth from the nearby hills. Somewhere beyond the tower, shepherds were quietly leading their sheep towards stone shelters before darkness settled completely. The soft ringing of tiny bells drifted through the evening air before gradually fading into silence. The keeper listened for a moment. Sounds traveled differently at sunset. The cooling air carried distant voices farther than during the heat of the afternoon. Sometimes he heard fishermen laughing as they secured their boats. Sometimes the steady tapping of a carpenter finishing one last repair before going home. Sometimes only the endless breathing of the sea. He welcomed them all. They reminded him that the lighthouse was never truly separate from the community it served. Although he spent many hours alone, his work quietly touched many lives. A merchant arriving safely after sunset, a fisherman finding the harbor entrance through darkness, a family waiting patiently beside the shore for familiar sails to appear. The keeper rarely met those people. He did not need to. It was enough simply to know that somewhere beyond the horizon, someone might look toward the lighthouse and quietly feel relieved. The sun continued its slow descent. Golden light rested upon the ancient stones of the tower. Long shadows stretched across the cliffs. The day was gently preparing to hand its place to the evening, and once again, without excitement, without hesitation, without hurry, the lighthouse keeper prepared to welcome another peaceful night beside the sea. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, just as it always had along this quiet stretch of the Roman coast. There was no single moment when the day suddenly became different. Instead, the sunlight softened a little at a time. The shadows grew longer. The warmth of the stones slowly began to fade. The keeper noticed these gentle changes without needing to think about them. Years of careful observation had taught him to read the passing hours with little more than the movement of light across the tower walls. The sea also began its quiet transformation. During the brightest part of the day, the water sparkled beneath the sun like countless tiny pieces of polished glass. Now the colors became deeper. The bright blue slowly gave way to softer shades of silver and pale gold. Small waves continued their endless journey toward the shore, but they seemed calmer somehow, as if the sea itself welcomed the coming evening. The keeper walked once more around the platform at the top of the lighthouse. He carried no sense of urgency. There was still time before darkness. Preparation was never rushed. He believed that calm beginnings often led to calm endings. Near the center of the platform rested the large bronze brazier that had served the lighthouse for many years. Its surface had darkened through countless evenings of faithful use. The metal carried small marks left by heat and time. To another person, these marks might have appeared as imperfections. To the keeper, they were simply reminders of many peaceful nights that had already passed. He gently brushed away a little ash left from the previous watch. The movement was slow and familiar. A soft cloud of pale dust drifted into the evening air before disappearing completely. Soon fresh wood would rest inside the brazier. Soon the first flames would appear once again, but not yet. Everything had its proper time. Below the cliffs, several fishing boats were returning home. Their sails caught the last warm light of the day. From this distance, they seemed to glide almost silently across the water. The keeper watched them for several minutes. He recognized some of the boats by their shape alone. One had a slightly taller mast. Another carried a darker sail that had been repaired many times. Another always seemed to return a little later than the others. These were small details, yet after many years, small details became familiar companions. The harbor slowly welcomed each boat. Ropes were tied, baskets were lifted ashore. Fresh fish were carried toward the marketplace where tomorrow's trading would begin. None of the work appeared hurried. The people understood that another day would come. There was no need to race against time. The keeper appreciated that quiet wisdom. He believed that patience was not simply a useful habit. It was a way of seeing the world. To wait for bread to bake, to allow olive trees to mature, to repair a fishing net one careful knot at a time, or to prepare a lighthouse before nightfall. Each task rewarded steady hands more than hurried ones. A small flock of swallows crossed the evening sky. They circled above the cliffs for a few peaceful moments before disappearing toward the village. Soon they too would find places to rest until morning. The keeper smiled softly as he watched them vanish into the fading light. Even the birds followed familiar routines. Every living thing seemed to move according to quiet rhythms that required no instructions. The wind carried the faint scent of wild herbs growing among the rocky hillside. Mixed with the smell of salt water and sun-warmed stone, it created an aroma the keeper had known for most of his life. If someone had asked him to describe the scent of home, this would have been his answer. Not one single fragrance, but many gentle ones woven together by the sea breeze. He reached for the bundle of carefully prepared kindling resting beside the brazier. Each thin piece of wood had been cut months earlier during the dry season. He arranged them patiently, crossing one piece over another with practiced care. There was no complicated design, only enough space for air to move freely between the wood. A healthy fire, like many good things, depended upon balance. Too little space, and it struggled. Too much, and it burned too quickly. Experience had taught him where that quiet balance could be found. The first stars had not yet appeared. The western sky still held enough light to outline the distant hills beyond the harbor. Soon the colors would deepen. Soon the evening would once again become the night, and as it had on countless evenings before, the lighthouse would awaken. Not with noise, not with celebration, but with a single steady flame, quietly shining across the Mediterranean, guiding strangers toward a safe and familiar shore. The first star appeared so quietly that it could easily have gone unnoticed. The keeper had been watching the western horizon, where the last gentle colors of sunset slowly faded into shades of blue and gray. Then, without announcement, a single point of light emerged above the sea. Soon another followed, then another. Before long, the familiar pattern of the night sky began to reveal itself once again. The keeper always welcomed this moment. It marked the peaceful meeting of two faithful companions, the stars above and the beacon below. Each served in its own quiet way. Neither competed with the other. Together, they helped guide those who traveled across the open waters of the Mediterranean. He knelt beside the carefully prepared brazier. Everything was already in place. The dry kindling rested neatly beneath the larger pieces of seasoned wood. The arrangement looked simple, yet it reflected years of quiet experience. A fire that began with patience usually burned with patience. The keeper reached for a small clay lamp that had remained sheltered from the evening breeze. Its tiny flame glowed steadily. He lowered it toward the waiting kindling. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then a thin ribbon of smoke curled gently upward. A small orange flame appeared beneath the wood. It hesitated only briefly before finding another dry branch, then another. The fire was awake once more. The keeper did not rush to feed it. He simply watched. The flames slowly gathered strength. The smallest twigs burned first. Their warmth invited the larger pieces of timber to join them. Little by little, the fire grew brighter. There was a lesson hidden within that quiet process. Strong fires rarely began with large logs alone. They began with small flames, carefully protected until they were ready to grow. Many things in life seem to follow the same gentle pattern. Knowledge, trust, friendship, skill, none of them appeared fully formed. Each grew patiently through steady care. The keeper rested both hands upon the warm stone surrounding the beacon. Already, its familiar glow stretched across the nearby sea. The light did not travel with noise. It simply reached outward into the darkness, calm, steady, dependable, far beyond the harbor. The first returning fishing boat noticed the beacon. Its crew adjusted their course almost without thinking. They had followed this light so many times that it had become part of their memory. The lighthouse did not command them, it quietly reassured them. The keeper imagined the fishermen finishing another ordinary day. Perhaps they spoke softly among themselves as they gathered their nets. Perhaps they sat in comfortable silence, listening only to the water against the hull. Long days at sea often taught people that silence could be shared without becoming uncomfortable. The keeper understood that feeling well. Many nights he had spoken no words for hours at a time, yet he had never felt alone. The sea offered constant company, the wind remained a faithful visitor, the fire answered with its quiet crackling voice. And above everything, the stars continued their endless journey. A cool breeze carried the scent of the evening once more. The warmth of the day slowly slipped away. The stones beneath the keeper's feet released the last of the sunlight they had gathered. The air became wonderfully fresh. He pulled his wool cloak gently around his shoulders. The familiar fabric felt reassuring. Its edges had become soft after many years of use. Small repairs, stitched carefully by patient hands, reminded him that useful things deserved to be cared for rather than quickly replaced. He believed people were much the same. Every line upon a weathered face told the story of another season lived. Every rough hand reflected years of honest work. Time rarely diminished true worth. Often, it quietly revealed it. The keeper added one carefully chosen log to the growing fire. The flames welcomed it with gentle confidence. Tiny sparks floated upward into the evening sky. For just a moment they seemed to join the stars before disappearing into the darkness. He watched them without speaking. He had seen that quiet dance thousands of times, yet it never seemed ordinary, not because it was dramatic, but because it was peaceful. Some moments remained beautiful simply because they asked for nothing except quiet attention. The night continued to settle over the Roman coast. The harbor lights became fewer. The sounds of the village softened. Doors closed gently. Footsteps became less frequent. Families gathered inside warm homes to share evening meals before resting for the night. And high above the shoreline, the lighthouse once again began its silent watch. Its warm light reached patiently across the sea, just as it had yesterday, just as it would tomorrow, and just as it would for as long as careful hands continued to tend the faithful flame. By now, the night had become completely familiar once again. The last colors of evening had quietly disappeared beyond the western horizon, leaving only the soft glow of the lighthouse and the countless stars spread across the Roman sky. There was no feeling of beginning or ending, only the peaceful continuation of a rhythm that had repeated itself for generations. The keeper stood beside the beacon with calm and patient attention. He no longer thought about each movement of his hands. Years of practice had turned careful work into quiet habit. Every so often he adjusted a piece of wood. Every so often he watched the flames settle into a steady glow. Every so often he lifted his eyes toward the sea. Nothing required haste. Nothing demanded excitement. The night rewarded those who moved slowly. Far below, the harbor had become almost silent. The boats rested gently against their moorings. Their wooden hulls rose and fell with the smallest movement of the tide. Ropes stretched and relaxed with a soft creaking sound that blended naturally with the whisper of the waves. The keeper had listened to these sounds for so many years that they had become part of the lighthouse itself. If one sound disappeared, he would notice it immediately, not because it was loud, but because it belonged. The breeze became a little cooler as the hours passed. It traveled across the open Mediterranean before climbing the rocky cliffs surrounding the tower. The keeper drew his cloak a little closer. The thick wool carried the faint scent of smoke from many nights spent beside the beacon. It was an old cloak now. The edges had softened with age. Small patches covered places where the cloth had worn thin. Each careful repair told the quiet story of someone who believed that good things should be cared for, not carelessly replaced. The keeper shared that belief. The lighthouse itself had survived for the same reason. Every loose stone had been set back into place. Every weathered door had been repaired. Every worn tool had been maintained with patience. Great buildings rarely endured because they were perfect. They endured because ordinary people quietly looked after them. He rested one hand upon the ancient wall beside him. The stone felt comfortably warm from the nearby fire. It had witnessed thousands of sunsets, thousands of storms, thousands of peaceful nights like this one. Generations of keepers had leaned against these same stones while watching the sea. Some had remained for only a few years. Others had spent most of their lives here. Time had gently carried them all forward, yet the lighthouse remained, not unchanged, but faithfully cared for. The keeper found quiet comfort in that thought. Perhaps people were not remembered only through names written in books. Perhaps they were also remembered through the care they left behind. A well-built wall, a healthy olive grove, a carefully repaired fishing boat, or a lighthouse that continued shining because someone had patiently looked after it. The stars climbed a little higher overhead. The moon reflected softly upon the water, creating a silver path that seemed to stretch toward the distant horizon. Somewhere beyond that quiet line of light, ships continued their slow journeys through the night. The people aboard those vessels would never know the keeper personally. They would never hear his voice. They would never shake his hand. Yet his quiet work would become part of their safe passage. There was something deeply peaceful about helping strangers without ever expecting recognition. Perhaps kindness was often like the light of a lighthouse. It traveled farther than the person who created it could ever see. The keeper smiled gently at the thought. Then he looked once more into the fire. The flames moved with calm confidence. They no longer needed constant attention. They had found their steady rhythm. The keeper believed that people sometimes did the same. Youth often hurried. Experience learned to slow down. With passing years came quieter voices, calmer decisions, and a deeper appreciation for ordinary moments. He had discovered that peace was rarely found in grand events. It was found in familiar routines, in well-used tools, in the smell of salt carried by the evening wind, in the sound of gentle waves touching ancient rocks, in the simple satisfaction of completing another night's work with patience and care. For a long while, he simply stood there, watching, listening, breathing. The fire glowed steadily beside him, the sea whispered below. The stars continued their endless journey above. Nothing needed to be added. Nothing needed to be changed. The world seemed perfectly content exactly as it was, and perhaps that quiet feeling was the greatest gift the lighthouse had ever offered. Not only guidance across dark waters, but a gentle reminder that steady hands, patient hearts, and ordinary lives have always helped the world move forward, one peaceful evening at a time. The keeper turned his eyes toward the horizon once again. The beacon continued to shine, the Mediterranean continued to breathe, and the long, quiet night continued exactly as it always had, calmly, faithfully, without ever asking to be remembered. The passing of time became more difficult to notice as the years quietly gathered around the lighthouse. Individual days slowly blended into seasons, the seasons gently blended into years, and the years themselves became little more than peaceful memories, carried softly by the sea breeze that never seemed to stop visiting the old Roman coast. The keeper no longer thought very often about how many years he had lived inside the shadow of the tower. There seemed little reason to count them. Each evening had asked for the same careful attention. Each morning had offered the same quiet satisfaction. The work had changed him so gradually that he could not remember exactly when patience had become his most natural habit. Perhaps it had happened without his noticing. Many worthwhile changes arrived that way, very slowly, very quietly, without asking to be observed. The lighthouse itself reflected that same gentle passage of time. The lowest stones had been touched by countless waves. Winter storms had polished their rough edges. Summer sunlight had warmed them year after year. Tiny patches of pale moss appeared after seasons of rain, only to fade again beneath the dry warmth of summer. Nothing remained exactly the same, yet nothing truly seemed lost. Each season simply left behind another small memory upon the ancient walls. The keeper often walked around the tower during the quiet hours of daylight, not because he searched for problems, but because careful observation had become part of his daily life. He noticed a small crack before it became a larger one. He replaced worn rope before it failed. He carried fresh wood beneath shelter before rain could reach it. These were simple habits, almost invisible to anyone passing by. Yet simple habits often protected important things. He believed that waiting until something was broken was rarely the wisest path. Gentle care given early often prevented greater troubles later. The same seemed true for gardens, for fishing boats, for friendships, and perhaps even for the human heart. Far below, the sea continued its endless conversation with the shore. The keeper smiled softly. He had listened to those waves for so many years that they almost sounded like familiar voices. No single wave remained. Each one arrived. Each one departed. Yet together they created something wonderfully constant. Perhaps communities were built in much the same way. People were born. People grew older. People quietly disappeared from the world. New children arrived to take their place. The faces changed. The rhythm continued. Sometimes he remembered elderly fishermen whose boats no longer rested inside the harbor. He remembered the baker who had once greeted everyone with flour upon his hands and laughter in his voice. He remembered children who had played beside the cliffs and who were now mothers and fathers themselves. Time had gently carried them forward. The keeper never found sadness in those thoughts, only gratitude. To witness many years was itself a quiet privilege. Not everyone received such a gift. A pair of swallows circled above the tower before disappearing toward the village. Soon they would return again, just as they always did. Birds remembered these cliffs, the sea remembered the shore, the lighthouse remembered its purpose, and the keeper remembered his quiet responsibilities. Memory did not always require words. Sometimes memory lived inside familiar movements, the careful way his hands arranged the firewood, the habit of looking first toward the eastern horizon each evening, the quiet pause before lighting the beacon. His body remembered what years of practice had patiently taught. He no longer needed to think about every step. Experience had become its own gentle guide. The afternoon breeze shifted slightly. It carried the faint scent of pine from distant hills beyond the coastline. The keeper breathed deeply. Even after so many years, the changing scents of the seasons still brought him quiet pleasure. Spring smelled fresh. Summer carried warmth and dry grass. Autumn brought damp earth after gentle rain. Winter arrived with crisp air that seemed wonderfully clear beneath the stars. The sea remained present through them all, always familiar, always patient. The keeper sometimes wondered whether future generations would stand upon this same tower. Perhaps another young apprentice would climb these worn steps many years from now. Perhaps that young man would rest his hands upon the very same stones, listen to the very same waves, watch the very same evening sky. The thought pleased him. The lighthouse had never belonged to one keeper alone. It belonged to time itself. Each generation borrowed it for a little while, then quietly entrusted it to the next. There was something deeply comforting about that gentle exchange. Nothing truly ended, it simply continued. One careful hand replacing another, one peaceful evening following the last, one quiet life becoming part of a much longer story beside the endless Mediterranean Sea. As another gentle evening approached, the keeper found himself following the same familiar path that had guided him for many years. There was comfort in repetition. The stone staircase welcomed his steady footsteps. The cool walls of the tower reflected the last quiet light of the afternoon. Nothing along the climb seemed unfamiliar. Every step carried a memory. Every turn of the staircase felt like greeting an old friend. When he reached the top, he rested both hands upon the ancient stone railing. The sea stretched peacefully in every direction. The horizon remained calm and unbroken. Far away, the sunlight rested gently upon the water, creating a broad ribbon of golden light that slowly narrowed as the sun continued its patient journey toward the west. The keeper watched without speaking. There was never any need to hurry the evening. The sun had always understood its path. He often wondered how many keepers had stood in this very place before him. Perhaps dozens, perhaps hundreds. Some had likely stayed only a few seasons, others may have spent most of their lives beside the beacon. Their names had gradually disappeared from memory, their voices had long since fallen silent, yet traces of their careful work remained everywhere. The smooth wooden handle of an old tool, the repaired hinge upon the heavy door, the worn edges of the staircase, the carefully shaped stones surrounding the fire. Every generation had quietly left behind small acts of care. The keeper found that thought deeply reassuring. People often believed that history belonged only to emperors, generals, or famous scholars. But here, beside the sea, history was written differently. It lived inside ordinary routines, inside repaired ropes, inside clean lanterns, inside dry stacks of firewood waiting patiently beneath their shelter. Small acts repeated faithfully across many years quietly became history of their own. He slowly opened one of the storage chests kept near the beacon. Inside rested several simple tools: an iron poker, a small hammer, a pair of worn leather gloves, a coarse brush for sweeping away old ash. None of them were beautiful, none had been decorated. Each had been chosen because it performed its task well. The keeper lifted the brush and gently cleaned a thin layer of ash that had gathered around the stone hearth. The soft grey dust drifted away with the evening breeze. The work took only a few moments. Still, he completed it with the same care he gave to every other task. He believed there were no truly unimportant duties, only duties completed with greater or lesser attention. Below the cliffs, the village continued its peaceful rhythm. Smoke rose from kitchen fires. Families prepared their evening meals. Children returned home after long afternoons spent outdoors. Neighbors exchanged quiet greetings as they passed along the narrow streets. The keeper could not hear every conversation, nor did he wish to. The gentle murmur of distant voices was enough. It reminded him that life continued beyond the lighthouse walls. Although he spent many hours alone, he never felt separated from the community. His work belonged to them, and in quiet ways, their work belonged to him as well. The baker's bread filled his table. The carpenter repaired his wooden door. The potter shaped the clay jars that stored the oil. The woodcutter prepared the timber that warmed the beacon. No life stood entirely alone. Even the quietest worker depended upon many unseen hands. That thought filled the keeper with quiet gratitude. He looked once more toward the sea. The first evening breeze had begun to strengthen, though only slightly. It carried the familiar scent of salt and cool water. The keeper tilted his face toward the wind. He could almost judge tomorrow's weather by its touch alone. Not perfectly. Nature always kept a few gentle mysteries, but experience often offered small hints. The wind felt steady. The sky remained clear. The sea moved with slow, even waves. It would likely be another peaceful night. He smiled softly, not because calm weather made his work easier, but because somewhere beyond the horizon, sailors would find a kinder sea awaiting them. The keeper had learned long ago that peace was often shared. A calm night for him was also a calm night for countless strangers crossing the water. The sun slipped a little lower. Its warm light turned from gold to soft amber. The tower cast a long shadow across the rocky hillside. Soon the stars would quietly return. Soon the beacon would awaken once again. The keeper gathered the first pieces of carefully seasoned wood and placed them beside the brazier. Each movement remained slow, measured, almost effortless. He paused for a moment and listened. The sea whispered below. The breeze passed gently through the dry grass. A distant gull called once before settling for the night. Nothing else disturbed the quiet. The world seemed perfectly content with its gentle rhythm, and the keeper, standing beside the faithful lighthouse, felt exactly the same. By this hour of the evening, the lighthouse had once again settled into its familiar rhythm. The beacon burned with a calm and steady light. The flames no longer reached eagerly toward the sky. Instead, they moved with quiet confidence, rising and falling in slow, gentle patterns that the keeper had watched for so many years that they felt almost as familiar as breathing. He remained close to the fire without feeling the need to do very much. Most of the careful preparation had already been completed before sunset. Now, the work was simply to remain present, to notice small changes before they became larger ones, to place another piece of wood upon the glowing coals when the time felt right, to watch, to listen, to wait. Patience had become the truest companion of every lighthouse keeper. It asked for no reward. It offered no applause. It simply remained beside those who welcomed it. The keeper had come to believe that patience was not something a person possessed from birth. It was something quietly learned, a little each day, a little each season, until one morning, many years later, it felt as natural as the rhythm of the waves below. He looked toward the dark outline of the harbor. Only a handful of small lights could now be seen in the village. Most families had finished their evening meals. Doors had been closed against the cool sea air. Oil lamps glowed softly behind wooden shutters. The narrow streets, so full of gentle movement during the day, now rested peacefully beneath the stars. The keeper imagined children already asleep beneath warm wool blankets, parents speaking quietly before allowing the fire inside their homes to grow smaller, elderly neighbors sitting together for a few peaceful moments before retiring for the night. Ordinary evenings had always formed the greater part of ordinary lives. History often remembered celebrations, festivals, victories, ceremonies. But peaceful evenings like this one had quietly shaped generations. Most people would never write about them, yet they were lived, again and again, across countless homes throughout the Roman world. The keeper found comfort in that simple thought. He added another carefully chosen log to the fire. The dry wood settled gently among the glowing coals. For a brief moment, a shower of tiny golden sparks floated upward. They rose only a short distance before disappearing into the darkness. The keeper watched them without expectation. Their beauty lasted only a moment, yet perhaps that made them even more precious. Not everything needed to remain forever to have meaning. The breeze shifted slightly, carrying the familiar scent of salt water through the tower. It cooled the keeper's face before passing quietly toward the hills beyond. He closed his eyes for a single slow breath. The air smelled exactly as he remembered from so many evenings before. Salt, smoke, dry timber, warm stone. These simple scents had become part of his life for so long that he could no longer imagine the world without them. Memory often lived inside such quiet details, a familiar smell, the touch of weathered wood, the sound of gentle footsteps upon ancient stone. Sometimes these small things carried more memories than words ever could. He opened his eyes and looked upward. The stars seemed especially bright tonight. Without the lights of great cities, the heavens revealed themselves with remarkable clarity. The keeper had never learned the names of every constellation. He did not feel that he needed to. It was enough simply to recognize them, to notice that they returned each season, to understand that they traveled their silent paths with perfect patience. The stars never hurried. The moon never rushed across the sky. The sea never became tired of reaching the shore. Nature offered the same quiet lesson every night. There was no need to hurry through time. The keeper rested upon his old wooden stool once again. The familiar seat welcomed him as it always had. Its surface had become smooth through many years of use. He wondered briefly about the craftsmen who had first shaped it. Perhaps they had never imagined it would remain inside the lighthouse for so many decades. Perhaps they had simply wished to make something strong enough to serve another person well. If so, they had certainly succeeded. Useful things often lived much longer than fashionable ones. The fire continued its calm conversation with the night. Soft crackles rose now and then before fading once more into silence. The keeper listened carefully. He had learned that every fire possessed its own gentle voice. A dry log sounded different from damp wood. A strong flame whispered differently from a fading ember. These were small observations, yet they had quietly guided him through countless nights. Far beyond the reach of the beacon, unseen ships crossed the dark Mediterranean. Some carried grain, others carried olive oil, pottery, cloth, or wine. Some transported letters between distant provinces, others simply carried families returning home. The people aboard those ships would never know that an ordinary man stood beside an ordinary fire, quietly watching over the coast. And yet, for a few brief moments during their journey, his steady light would become part of their story. The keeper smiled gently. That was enough. Not fame, not recognition. Simply the quiet knowledge that faithful work could reach farther than a person ever witnessed. The beacon continued to glow. The waves continued to rise and fall beneath the cliffs. The stars slowly turned above the sleeping world, and time itself seemed to move so gently that it became almost impossible to notice at all. The night had now reached one of its quietest hours. There was very little left to do. The beacon burned with a calm and faithful light. The sea continued its endless breathing below the cliffs. The stars rested above the world as they had done for countless generations. The keeper stood beside the fire without speaking. He had discovered long ago that silence was never truly empty. It carried the gentle sound of waves, the quiet whisper of the wind, the soft crackle of seasoned wood, the distant rhythm of water meeting stone. These sounds had become familiar companions. Together they formed a peaceful melody that never needed to change. He looked once again across the dark Mediterranean. The horizon had disappeared into the night. Sea and sky seemed to meet without any clear boundary. Only the steady light of distant stars reminded him where the heavens began. He often thought that the sea looked larger at night, not because it truly changed, but because darkness invited the imagination to wander farther than daylight ever could. Still, his thoughts never wandered very far. The lighthouse had taught him to return his attention to simple things: the warmth of the fire, the steady weight of the stone beneath his feet, the quiet movement of the breeze against his face. Simple moments were enough. They always had been. He rested one hand upon the old wooden railing. Its surface had become smooth after many years of careful use. Thousands of hands had likely rested there before his own. Some young, some old, some strong, some tired after long nights beside the beacon. None had remained forever, yet each had cared for the lighthouse during their own small place in time. The keeper found quiet comfort in that thought. Every generation borrowed the tower for a little while. Then, when their work was finished, they gently placed that responsibility into the hands of someone else. Nothing needed to last forever, only long enough to be cared for well. He believed the sea understood this lesson better than anyone. Every wave disappeared almost as soon as it reached the shore, yet the sea itself remained. Every sunset faded, yet evening always returned. Every flame eventually became glowing embers, yet another fire could always be lit. The world quietly continued through gentle renewal rather than sudden endings. A small owl passed silently above the cliffs. Its wings made almost no sound as it disappeared into the darkness beyond the tower. The keeper followed its flight for only a moment before returning his eyes to the beacon. Even the birds of the night trusted familiar paths. The keeper smiled softly. He had learned that peace often came from returning to places already known. Familiar roads, familiar faces, familiar routines. The same staircase climbed every evening. The same fire tended every night. The same horizon waiting patiently each morning. There was wisdom in such gentle repetition. Many people searched for lives filled with constant change. The keeper had found quiet happiness somewhere much simpler. He found it in doing one task well, again, and again, and again, without becoming weary of its familiar rhythm. He believed that careful attention transformed ordinary work into something quietly meaningful. A loaf of bread became comforting because someone patiently kneaded the dough. A fishing boat returned safely because someone carefully repaired its sails. A manuscript survived because careful hands copied each line. A lighthouse guided strangers because one ordinary keeper remembered to tend the fire. The work itself was simple, its faithfulness made it remarkable. The flames moved gently inside the great bronze brazier, their light reflected softly across the ancient stone walls before reaching out into the darkness beyond the tower. Somewhere far across the water, a sailor might look toward that warm glow. Perhaps he would feel a little less uncertain. Perhaps he would quietly recognize the coastline ahead. Perhaps he would simply know that land was near. The keeper would never meet him, he would never hear the sailor's story, yet that quiet connection was enough. Not every kindness required an introduction. Not every helpful act needed to be remembered. Some of the most valuable work in history was completed by people whose names quietly disappeared with time, and still, their work remained. The keeper lifted another small piece of seasoned wood and placed it gently upon the glowing embers. The flames welcomed it without hurry. There was no rush, there never had been. The night was long, the fire understood its purpose, so did he. For several peaceful moments, he simply watched the light. Nothing interrupted the silence. Nothing asked for attention. The lighthouse stood exactly where it had always stood. The sea continued exactly as it always had. The stars moved along their ancient paths with calm certainty. The keeper breathed slowly. He felt grateful for another ordinary night, another ordinary watch, another opportunity to care for something that would continue long after his own footsteps had faded from the stone staircase. Perhaps that was enough for any life, to leave a place a little stronger than it had been, to complete each day's work with quiet care, to expect nothing more than the chance to begin again tomorrow. The beacon continued to shine into the darkness. The Mediterranean continued its endless rhythm. The old lighthouse remained patient beneath the stars, and the keeper remained beside the faithful flame, just as those before him had done, and just as others, many years from now, would quietly do again. The night had become so peaceful that it almost seemed to stand still. The keeper no longer thought about the passing hours. There was little reason to measure time now. The beacon continued to burn with the same quiet confidence it had carried throughout the evening. The sea continued its endless breathing. The stars continued their silent journey across the heavens. Everything moved exactly as it should. He stood beside the warm glow of the fire and listened. Not for danger, not for change, simply for the familiar sounds that had become part of his life. The gentle crackle of seasoned wood, the whisper of the wind around the tower, the slow rhythm of waves folding themselves against the rocks below. Every sound felt calm, every sound belonged. The keeper had come to understand that a peaceful life was not a life without repetition. It was a life that welcomed repetition. The same careful climb up the staircase, the same steady fire, the same view across the Mediterranean, the same stars returning each season. Many people searched for excitement. The keeper searched for steadiness. He believed steadiness was its own quiet gift. There was something deeply comforting about knowing what the evening would ask of him. Nothing surprising, nothing dramatic, only another opportunity to care for the light. He walked slowly around the beacon. The bronze brazier glowed softly, warming the cool air around it. The flames rose and settled with an easy rhythm. Sometimes they leaned gently with the breeze, then they straightened again. Never hurried, never restless. The keeper smiled. Even fire seemed calmer when it was tended with patience. He rested upon the old wooden stool for a little while. His hands folded comfortably in his lap. His eyes remained upon the beacon. He did not need to think about tomorrow. Tomorrow would arrive when it was ready. For now, this quiet moment was enough. The lighthouse had taught him many lessons through the years, not with words, but with simple routines, to care for small things before they became large ones, to move slowly enough to notice quiet changes, to trust that faithful work mattered, even when no one saw it. These lessons had become part of him, just as surely as the smell of salt had become part of the sea breeze. Far beyond the reach of the lighthouse, unseen ships continued across the dark water. Some travelers were returning home, others were leaving familiar shores behind. Each journey moved at its own gentle pace. The keeper wished them all calm seas. Though they would never hear his thoughts, his light quietly traveled toward them. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes a steady light was the only greeting needed between strangers. Above him, the stars appeared unchanged, yet he knew they slowly crossed the heavens, just as they always had. Movement did not always need to be noticed. Some journeys were so gentle that they could only be understood by those willing to wait. The keeper had become one of those people. Waiting no longer felt difficult. It felt natural, like breathing, like listening, like watching the sea. He closed his eyes for one slow breath. The cool night air filled his lungs. When he opened them again, everything remained exactly as before. The fire glowed. The waves whispered. The lighthouse stood patiently beside the sea. and that quiet constancy brought him a deep sense of peace. The night continued exactly as it always had. Without hurry, without interruption, without asking anything from those who quietly watched over it, the keeper remained beside the beacon, allowing its gentle warmth to rest upon his hands. The fire no longer needed much attention. It had found its steady rhythm. Every now and then, he would adjust a small piece of wood. Every now and then, he would look toward the quiet sea. Most of the time, he simply remained still. There was comfort in doing very little. For many years, he had believed that every moment must be filled with work. The lighthouse had slowly taught him something different. Some moments asked for careful action, others asked only for quiet presence. Both were equally important. The waves below continued their endless conversation with the shore. No two waves were exactly alike, yet together they created one familiar voice. The keeper had listened to that voice for so long that he could almost imagine the sea speaking gently to the ancient cliffs, not in words, but in rhythm, a rhythm older than memory, older than Rome, older than the lighthouse itself. The wind moved softly around the tower. It carried the scent of salt, weathered stone, and the faint trace of warm smoke from the beacon. The keeper breathed slowly. He had known these scents for most of his life. They had become part of his own memories. Just as a family remembers the smell of fresh bread, or a gardener remembers the scent of rain upon dry earth, the keeper remembered the quiet fragrance of the sea at night. Above him, the stars continued their patient journey. They asked for nothing. They hurried toward nothing. They simply traveled the same ancient paths that countless generations had quietly admired before him. Perhaps somewhere beyond the horizon, another lighthouse keeper stood beneath the same stars. Perhaps he too rested beside a warm fire. Perhaps he too listened to the sea before placing another piece of wood upon the glowing embers. The keeper smiled softly at the thought. Across the vast coastline of the Roman world, ordinary people continued their ordinary work. Millers slowly turned heavy stones. Bakers prepared tomorrow's bread before sunrise. Potters shaped fresh clay with patient hands. Farmers looked toward the changing seasons. Fishermen trusted the tide. And lighthouse keepers quietly watched over the sea. None of them expected songs to be written about their lives. Most would never appear inside great books. Yet together they carried the quiet weight of everyday life. Empires were remembered through monuments, but they endured through ordinary people. People who arrived before sunrise. People who repaired what had become worn. People who finished simple tasks with careful hands. People who quietly returned the next day to do the same work once more. The keeper understood that now more clearly than ever. His light reached beyond the tower. His work reached beyond himself. Even if no one remembered his name, the care he gave each evening became part of countless safe journeys across the sea. That was enough. It had always been enough. The fire settled lower. Its bright flames became calm, glowing embers. Their warm light continued to fill the tower with a quiet amber glow. Soft shadows rested peacefully upon the ancient stone walls. Nothing appeared lonely. Nothing felt empty. The silence itself seemed warm. The keeper looked one last time across the dark Mediterranean. The sea remained patient. The stars remained faithful. The lighthouse remained strong. And somewhere beyond the distant horizon, tomorrow was already making its slow journey toward another dawn. He did not need to hurry toward it. Morning would arrive when it was ready. Another evening would follow. Another fire would be prepared. Another quiet watch would begin. Just as it always had. Just as it always would. He rested both hands upon the warm stone beside the beacon. Closed his eyes for one slow, peaceful breath. Then opened them once more. Nothing had changed. And somehow, that felt deeply comforting. The lighthouse continued to shine. The sea continued to breathe. The wind continued to wander along the cliffs. The stars continued their silent passage across the heavens. And the keeper simply remained, watching, listening, caring. One quiet night becoming another. One gentle season becoming the next. One ordinary life becoming part of an endless rhythm that stretched far beyond memory. Long after the footsteps of one keeper faded from the stone staircase, another would climb those same familiar steps. Another pair of careful hands would tend the faithful fire. Another calm voice would greet the sea without speaking a single word. The lighthouse would continue. The waves would continue. The stars would continue. And somewhere, in the peaceful silence between the fire, the sea, and the endless night, time itself would continue its slow and gentle journey. Without haste, without noise, without end.